Carnacki, the Ghost Finder, in William Hope Hodgson's The Gateway of the Monster. In response to Carnacki's usual card of invitation to have dinner and listen to a story, I arrived promptly at number 427 Cheyenne Walk to find the three others who were always invited to these happy little times there before me. 5 minutes later, Carnacki, Arkwright, Jessup, Taylor, and I were all engaged in the pleasant occupation of dining. "You've not been long away this time," I remarked, as I finished my soup, forgetting momentarily Carnacki's dislike of being asked even to skirt the borders of his story until such a time as he was ready. Then he would not stint words. "That's all," he replied with brevity. And I changed the subject, remarking that I had been buying a new gun, to which piece of news he gave an intelligent nod and a smile, which I think showed a genuinely good-humored appreciation of my intentional changing of the conversation. Later, when dinner was finished, Carnacki snugged himself comfortably down into his big chair along with his pipe and began his story with very little circumlocution. "As Hodgson was remarking just now, I've been away a short time, and for a very good reason too. I've only been away a short distance. The exact locality, I'm afraid I must not tell you, but it is less than 20 miles from here. Though, except for changing a name, that won't spoil the story. And it is a story too. One of the most extraordinary things I have run against. I received a letter a fortnight ago from a man I must call Anderson, asking for an appointment. I arranged a time, and when he came, I found that he wished me to investigate and to see whether I could not clear up a long-standing and too well, authenticated case of what he termed a haunting. He gave me very full particulars, and finally, as the thing seemed to present something unique, I decided to take it up. 2 days later, I drove to the house, late in the afternoon. I found it a very old place, standing quite alone on its grounds. Anderson had left a letter with the butler, I found, pleading excuses for his absence, and leaving the whole house at my disposal for my investigations. The butler evidently knew the object of my visit, and I questioned him pretty thoroughly during dinner, which I had in a rather lonely state. He's an old and privileged servant, and had the history of the Grey Room exact in detail. From him, I learned more particulars regarding two things that Anderson had mentioned, but in a casual manner. The first was the door of the Grey Room, which had been heard in the dead of night to open and slam heavily. And this, even though the butler knew it was locked, and the key on the bunch in his pantry. The second was that the bedclothes would always be found torn off the bed and hurled in a heap into the corner. But it was the door slamming that chiefly bothered the old butler. Many and many a time, he told me, had he lain awake and just got shivering with fright, listening. For sometimes the door would be slammed time after time. Thud, thud, thud. So that sleep was impossible. From Anderson, I knew already that the room had a history extending back over 150 years. 3 people had been strangled in it, an ancestor of his and his wife and child. This is authentic, as I had taken very great pains to discover. So that you can imagine, it was with a feeling I had a striking case to investigate that I went upstairs after dinner to have a look at the Grey Room. Peter, the old butler, was in rather a state about my going, and assured me with much solemnity that in all the 20 years of his service, no one had ever entered that room after nightfall. He begged me, in quite a fatherly way, to wait until morning, when there would be no danger, and then he could accompany me himself. Of course, I smiled a little at him and told him not to bother. I explained that I should do more than look around a bit, and perhaps affix a few seals. He need not fear. I was used to that sort of thing, but he shook his head when I said that. "There isn't many ghosts like ours, sir," he assured me, with mournful pride. And by Jove, he was right, as you'll see. I took a couple of candles and Peter followed with his bunch of keys. He unlocked the door, but would not come inside with me. He was evidently in a fright, and he renewed his request that I should put off my examination until daylight. Of course, I laughed at him again and told him he could stand sentry at the door and catch anything that may have come out. "It never comes outside, sir," he said in his funny old solemn manner. Somehow, he managed to make me feel as if I were going to have the creeps right away. Anyway, it was one to him, you know. I left him there and examined the room. It is a big apartment and well furnished in the grand style, with a huge four-poster which stands with its head to the end wall. There were 2 candles on the mantelpiece and 2 on each of the 3 tables in the room. I lit the lot, and after that, the room felt a little less inhumanly dreary. Though, mind you, it was quite fresh and well kept in every way. After I'd taken a good look around, I sealed lengths of bebe ribbon across the windows, along the walls, over the pictures, and over the fireplace and all the wall closets. All the time as I worked, the butler stood just without the door, and I could not persuade him to enter. Though I jested him a little, as I stretched the ribbons and went here and there about my work. Every now and again, he would say, "You'll excuse me, I'm sure, sir, but I do wish you would come out, sir. I'm fair in a quake for you." I told him he need not wait, but he was loyal enough in his way to what he considered his duty. He said he could not go away and leave me alone there. He apologized, but made it very clear that I did not realize the danger of the room, and I could see, generally, that he was in a pretty frightened state. All the same, I had to make the room so that I should know if anything material entered it, so I asked him not to bother me unless he really heard or saw something. He was beginning to get on my nerves, and the feel of the room was bad enough, without making it any nastier. For a time further, I worked, stretching ribbon across the floor and sealing them, so that the merest touch would have broken them, were anyone to venture into the room in the dark, with the intention of playing the fool. All this had taken me far longer than I had anticipated, and suddenly, I heard a clock strike 11. I had taken off my coat soon after commencing work. Now, however, as I had practically made an end of all that I intended to do, I walked across the settee and picked it up. I was in the act of getting into it when the old butler's voice, he had not said a word for the last hour, by the way, came sharp and frightened. "Come out, sir, quick! There's something going to happen!" Jove! But I jumped. And then, in the same moment, one of the candles on the table to the left went out. Now, whether it was the wind or what, I do not know, but just for the moment, I was enough startled to make a run for the door. Though I'm glad to say that I pulled up before I reached it. I simply could not bunk out, with the butler standing there after having, as it were, read him a sort of lesson on being brave, you know. So I just turned right around, picked up the 2 candles off the mantelpiece, and walked across to the table near the bed. Well, I saw nothing. I blew out the candle that was still alight. Then I went to those on the 2 tables and blew them out. Then outside of the door, the old man called again. "Oh, sir, to be told, to be told!" "All right, Peter," I said, and by Jove, my voice was not as steady as I would have liked. I made for the door and had a bit of work not to start running. I took some thundering long strides, as you can imagine. Near the door, I had the sudden feeling that there was a cold wind in the room. It was almost as if the window had been suddenly opened a little. I got to the door, and the old butler gave a step back, in a sort of instinctive way. "Collar the candles, Peter," I said, pretty sharply, and shoved them into his hands. I turned and caught the handle and slammed the door with a crash. Somehow, do you know, as I did so, I thought I felt something pull back on it. But it must have only been fancy. I turned the key in the lock, and then again, double locking the door. I felt easier then, and set to and sealed the door. In addition, I put my card over the keyhole and sealed it there. After which, I pocketed the key and went downstairs, with Peter, who was nervous and silent, leading the way. Poor old beggar. It had not struck me until that moment that he had been enduring a considerable strain during that last 2 or 3 hours. About midnight, I went to bed. My room lay at the end of the corridor upon which opens the door of the grey room. I counted the doors between it and mine, and found that 5 rooms lay between. And I'm sure you can understand that I was not sorry. Then, just as I was beginning to undress, an idea came to me, and I took my candle and sealing wax and sealed the doors of all 5 rooms. If any door slammed in the night, I should know which one. I returned to my room, locked the door, and went to bed. I was waked suddenly from a deep sleep by a loud crash somewhere out in the passage. I sat up in bed and listened, but heard nothing. Then I lit my candle. I was in the very act of lighting it when there came a bang of a door being violently slammed along the corridor. I jumped out of bed and got my revolver. I unlocked the door and went out into the passage, holding my candle high and keeping the pistol ready. Then a strange thing happened. I could not take a step forwards towards the grey room. You all know I'm not really a cowardly chap. I've gone into too many cases connected with ghostly things to be accused of that. But I tell you, I funked it. Simply funked it. Just like any blessed kid. There was something precious unholy in the air that night. I ran back into my room and shut the door and locked it. Then I sat on the bed all night and listened to the dismal thudding of a door up the corridor. The sound seemed to echo throughout all the house. Daylight came at last, and I washed and dressed. The door had not slammed for about an hour, and I was getting my nerve back again. I felt ashamed of myself, though. In some ways, it was silly. For when you're meddling with that sort of thing, your nerve is bound to go sometimes. And you just have to sit quiet, call yourself a coward until daylight. Sometimes, it's more than just a cowardice, I fancy. I believe that at times, it's something warning you and fighting for you. But all the same, I always feel mean and miserable after a time like that. When the day came properly, I opened my door, and keeping my revolver handy, went quietly along the passage. I had to pass the head of the stairs along the way, and who should I see coming up but the old butler, carrying a cup of coffee. He had merely tucked his nightshirt into his trousers and had on an old pair of carpet slippers. "Hello, Peter," I said, feeling suddenly cheerful. For I was as glad as any lost child to have a live human being close to me. "Where are you off to with those refreshments?" The old man gave a start and slopped some of the coffee. He stared up at me, and I could see that he looked white and done up. He came on up the stairs and held out the little tray to me. "I'm very thankful indeed, sir, to see you safe and well," he said. "I feared one time you might risk going into the grey room, sir. I've lain awake all night with the sound of the door. And when it came light, I thought I should make you a cup of coffee. I knew you'd want to look at the seals, and somehow it seems safer if there's 2, sir." "Peter," I said, "you're a brick. This is very thoughtful of you." And I drank the coffee. "Come along," I told him, and handed him back the tray. "I'm going to have a look at what the brutes have been up to. I simply hadn't the pluck to do it in the night." "I'm very thankful, sir," he replied. "Flesh and blood can do nothing, sir, against devils. And that's what's in the grey room after dark." I examined the seals on all the doors as I went along, and found them right. But when I got to the grey room, the seal was broken, though the card over the keyhole was untouched. I ripped it off and unlocked the door and went in, rather cautiously as you can imagine. But the whole room was empty of anything to frighten one, and there was heaps of light. I examined all my seals, and not a single one was disturbed. The old butler had followed me in, and suddenly he called out, "The bedclothes, sir!" I ran up to the bed and looked over, and surely, they were lying in the corner to the left of the bed. Jove! You can imagine how strange I felt. Something had been in this room. I stared for a while, from the bed to the clothes on the floor. I had a feeling that I did not want to touch either. Old Peter, though, did not seem to be affected that way. He went over to the bed coverings and was going to pick them up, as doubtless he had done every day these past 20 years. But I stopped him. I wanted nothing touched until I had finished my examination. This I must have spent a full hour over, and then I let Peter straighten up the bed. After which we went out, and I locked the door, for the room was getting on my nerves. I had a short walk, and then breakfast, after which I felt more my own man, and so returned to the grey room. And with Peter's help and one of the maids, I had everything taken out of the room, except the bed, even the very pictures. I examined the walls, floor, and ceiling then, with probe, hammer, and magnifying glass. I found nothing suspicious. And I can assure you, I began to realize, in very truth, that some incredible thing had been loose in the room during the past night. I sealed everything up again and went out, locking and sealing the door as before. After dinner, Peter and I unpacked some of my stuff, and I fixed up my camera and flashlight opposite to the door of the grey room, with a string from the trigger of the flashlight to the door. Then, you see, if the door were really opened, the flashlight would blare out, and there should be, very possibly, a very strange picture to examine in the morning. The last thing I did before leaving was to uncap the lens, and after that I went off to my bedroom and to bed, for I intended to be up at midnight, and to ensure this, I set my little alarm to call me. Also, I left my candle burning.